Larry Pratt's latest book is now available. On the Firing Line, Essays in the Defense of Liberty can be purchased from Gun Owners of America for only $18 plus shipping and handling. On the Firing Line is a collection of essays that GOA's Executive Director Larry Pratt has written over the last few years. They were composed in the battle to defend the right to keep and bear arms, as well as the rest of our liberties protected in the Bill of Rights. Pratt has taken on the arguments used by the enemies of freedom who would disarm and subjugate Americans. Pratt shows that the debate transcends firearms because the debate is really about control. Who will control the lives of private citizens? Will it be each person individually, or will it be the government? You can order your copy of On the Firing Line by going to the GOA website at gunowners.org, or you can call GOA's toll-free number 1-888-886-GUNS. That's 888-886-GUNS.
This is the Gun Owners News Hour, with the latest news about threats to your liberty and your right to keep and bear arms. Our host is Larry Pratt, Executive Director of Gun Owners of America. Our guests include elected and other public officials, journalists, citizen activists, and others who are fighting for the Bill of Rights, especially the Second Amendment. The Gun Owners News Hour covers a broad range of constitutional issues, particularly the debate over private ownership of firearms. Remember, the issue is not just about gun control, it's about control. Now, here's your host, Larry Pratt.
Hello and welcome to this edition of the News Hour. Today I want to take a look at a subject that at first blush you might wonder, okay, Pratt goes pretty far afield on some of the shows, but what in the world is the nexus between evolution and the Second Amendment? Well, folks, I would say we are in a sea of evolution with our Second Amendment. And if you want to understand very quickly why the Second Amendment is taken so lightly by so many people, particularly politicians, look no farther than the idea that's been percolating since the beginning, at least of the 19th century, evolution. That notion says that there's no need for God, and if you don't have a need for God, then there's no right and wrong, and if there's no right and wrong, then where in the world do you get off with a Constitution based on the very notion that there is a right and wrong, and that there is a Second Amendment that says that we have an obligation to protect life, not just a right to keep and bear arms. All of that just goes out to sea if we accept the idea that evolution is not only what brought us into the world from the slime, but also is the way we develop our societies by some sort of amorphous, unplanned evolution. Well, I want to discuss the whole idea of the man that made evolution famous and why we should take a second look at his big idea. Actually, it wasn't his big idea. After all, he kind of stole it, like, sort of. But The Dark Side of Charles Darwin is a fascinating read by Dr. Jerry Bergman, my guest today. And he has a subtitle, A Critical Analysis of an Icon of Science. Actually, after I read your book, Dr. Bergman, we probably should question whether or not we even use the word icon of science for a man who little science that he did it very poorly, and mostly was a politician of science. Is that an unfair summary?
That's very true.
Okay.
That's very true. He was a proselytizer of his worldview.
And a worldview
That's
that
what he focused on much of his life.
Yeah, much of his life. And he got a lot of these ideas, certainly from other people, and we're going to get into just how much he owed other people before we're finished talking with Dr. Jerry Bergman about his book, The Dark Side of Charles Darwin.
Now, more news about the threats to your liberties and your right to keep and bear arms. This is the Gun Owners News Hour. And here once again is your host, Executive Director of Gun Owners of America, Larry Pratt.
Today's guest is Dr. Jerry Bergman. He has written a book, The Dark Side of Charles Darwin. That is something I wish I had had when I was in graduate school. I went to the Methodist University, a Methodist church library attached to American University, which is a nominal Methodist institution, and I was doing a study. I was fascinated. How do the How did the natural scientists get off on evolution, and what was the initial reaction among those in the church community? Well, I was somewhat surprised to find out that at least the books that I had access to, they were all in for it. They thought it was neat. So the theologians that were not really rooted in Scripture itself, but had been affected by the modern currents of thinking of the 19th century, even into the 20th century, they thought evolution was I can't say answer to prayer, but because they don't think that way. But it was an answer to what they were looking for. Let's put it that way. And interesting thing is, I was expecting to find the arguments against evolution being most pointed coming from the church. It turns out, Dr. Bergman, you found that the most pointed criticisms in Darwin's own day, the early critics, were scientists.
Yes, they were. Many scientists were very critical with good reason of his ideas. Main criticism was there was no mechanism of producing genetic variety. And that's still the criticism today. There's no problem with survival of the fittest. Of course, if one is more fit than someone else, they're more likely to survive by definition. Animals that are more fit can survive better than animals that are less fit, again,
and
by definition.
The non-survivors are out of the gene pool as a result. So that makes sense.
Right. So the problem is not the survival of the fittest. The problem has always been, and still is, the arrival of the fittest.
I love that phrase.
That's something that Darwin... He couldn't explain that. Darwin just simply could not explain that.
Nor have his followers to this day. Yeah, has anybody come up with a plausible explanation yet?
Well, the most common one is mutations. But, of course, mutations, we know, accumulate and cause progressive damage to the genome. And mutations cause aging. They also cause not only aging of individuals, but also aging of species. So we know that the accumulation of mutations is causing the aging of species and, in some cases, the actual extinction of species. So evolution is true, but it's going the wrong way. It's going downward, not upward.
Sort of a devolution.
The title of his evolution, yeah, which is really what's happening.
So when we look at the long lifespans of the biblical fathers in the Old Testament who lived not that long after the flood, it's indeed... from what you've just been explaining, quite likely that, in fact, those were their true chronological 365 days a year ages, because mutations had not caused as much damage then as they have now.
Right, that's true, and so the lifespan we would expect would be shorter.
In our time.
Which is what we see. Not only we see that among many animals, not just people, but many other animals, we see shorter lifespan. Also, animals today are smaller than many were thousands of years ago.
And, of course, we know that from fossils and even, I guess, some written records. So, interesting.
Yeah.
Things are just moving the wrong way and yet this never seems to get brought up in most science classrooms. And, by the way, I should point out, I was looking at your credentials, you've taught about everything except physics, but all of the life sciences seem to be in your resume, and so you're not finding anybody that's come up with anything that even the other scientists, the secular scientists, have accepted as a plausible explanation for the damage done by mutation.
That's true. Yeah, that's very true.
So those of us who were subjected to evolution as a true period paragraph while we were in school, well, here's one more, folks, that you better be examining very, very critically. And I had really very little idea who Darwin was, but it turns out he wasn't a very pleasant guy. And one of the things that was striking to me is in your account of his life, give or take around the age 30, he began to seriously consider the ideas that had been all around in the air for some time about evolution. But once he embarked on this idea of developing some sort of argument for evolution, the Charles Darwin theory of explanation, if you will, that's when his life seemed to begin an ever increasingly nasty downward spiral, psychologically, physically, in terms of his health. And we'll discuss that when we pick up on the other side of the break.
The Bill of Rights protects every American's God-given right to keep and bear arms. Now that right is being seriously undermined as legally registered rifles are being confiscated in some parts of our country. If we're not careful, we may find ourselves with no right to own guns, and that's where Gun Owners of America comes in. Gun Owners of America is in Washington every day fighting for you to keep that right. Congressman Ron Paul has called GOA the only no-compromise gun lobby in Washington. You need to be part of this great grassroots group of activists who are keeping the heat on their members of Congress. Find out right now how you can join. Call 888-886-GUNS and get started receiving their fact-filled newsletters and action alerts. Call 888-886-GUNS or go to their webpage at gunowners.org and help make your voice heard in Washington. Make that call right now and call Gun Owners of America at 888-886-GUNS. Remember, it's not just about gun control, it's about control.
Now, more news about the threats to your liberties and your right to keep and bear arms. This is the Gun Owners News Hour. And here once again is your host, Executive Director of Gun Owners of America, Larry Pratt.
Back with Dr. Jerry Bergman, we're talking about Charles Darwin and evolution. Dr. Bergman's book is The Dark Side of Charles Darwin. It just occurred to me that it's not so much that he had a dark side as did he have a light side. He got worse and worse throughout his life. Miserable.
Yeah, and I think his health problems, as a number of scholars do, are related to his attempt to, in his words, murder God. And his major goal was in developing his theory was religious. And a lot of people ignore that. They think it was scientific, but in fact, he made it very clear that his major goal was to murder God, and to do that, he felt the way you do that is to eliminate the reason people believe in God. They believe in God because the creation demands a creator. Therefore, he was trying to come up with another creator aside from God to account for the creation. And this creator he came up with, of course, was evolution, or a Darwinianism, as we call it. Many people call it today.
He did have reservations about evolution because, as we're discussing right now, evolution is not good science. There's no good science that tells us that, oh, yes, these mutations account for the ever better organization of the genetic string and whatnot. And no, au contraire, mutations, as you've already pointed out, do only one thing, and they mess up my genetic string, and they make it so that my successors will have a tougher and tougher time of it because of the inheritance they got from me as messed up by any mutations that might have occurred. I was interested in your discussion early on in the book. It was probably put there for a good reason, before people throw up their hands and say, oh, this guy's got a God problem or something like that. But the very cell itself, one of the basic building blocks of life, as you point out in some detail, and I'd like to have you discuss it, the functioning of the cell is anti-evolutionary. What do you mean by that?
Yes, it is, because the complexity of the cell, not just the complexity, but the internal design is such where evolution simply can't explain it. In fact, most evolutionists don't even try to explain it. They come up with what Stephen Jay Gould calls just-so stories, which are stories which you really can't prove by science. But the complexity of the cell is such where literally every week we understand more and more about the cell, and we realize it's more and more complex and intricate, and as Michael Behe says, irreducibly complex, which means that in order for things to function, you have to have so many parts. When you go below that minimum number of parts, it doesn't work anymore. And Darwin, of course, had a major problem with that. He talked about the eye, said an eye is not going to function until you have a certain number of parts. And he recognized that the evolution of the eye is not very feasible. Now, today they say, well, half an eye is better than no eye. But the only thing about medicine, you realize that that's not the case, that indeed to get any eye at all, you need a certain number of parts in order for the eye to function. And, of course, that's what Behe means by irreducibly complex.
No, well, I was just going to say that one of the ways you summed up the nature of the functioning of the cell is that it's been designed to actively kill mutations. So it is anti-Darwinian in its very basic functioning.
That's true. There are at least a dozen different mechanisms which are designed in order to reduce or eliminate mutations. We have a repair system where if a mistake is made, and generally about 1 out of every 100 bases, which is the units of the cell, the DNA part of the cell, about 1 out of every 100 bases is wrong, and that's an average. It, of course, varies enormously. And these are taken care of by a repair mechanism that goes through and checks. It's actually kind of like a spell checker that goes through and checks the reproduction of DNA and production of mRNA and makes sure that it's perfect. And, of course, if any mistakes are found, then it is corrected. So you have an error-correcting mechanism, which, of course, Darwin never dreamed about. Darwin thought the cell was about as complex as a piece of mud or as soup which had virtually nothing in it, or Jell-O is another description often used. He thought it was very, very complex, and he had not a clue as to the enormous complexity of the cell and not a clue as to actually how it works.
But on the basis of belief, he proceeded ahead with popularizing the ideas of evolution. And truth be told, as you point out, these were not the cliff notes of his trip on the Beagle to the South Pacific, where he supposedly made all these observations in that area of the world. In fact, what little, quote-unquote, science he did, you point out he's a pretty lousy scientist. Didn't organize very well at all.
Well, he came up with a lot of ideas like gemules, which is the idea that the genes can actually, and of course he didn't know what genes were, but somehow the cell sent information to the gametes and the sex cells, and this information then could be passed on to one's offspring. So it's kind of a Lamarckian idea where if I work really hard, I build my muscles, then those muscles send information to the sex cells, which then my future offspring then would have more muscles. And, of course, there's simply no evidence for this, and it was proved wrong in his day. In fact, his own cousin actually proved it wrong first, and then others did as well. But nonetheless, he really had no explanation for the development of new biological information. Today, of course, as I said, mutations is the explanation, but that's like saying we're the result of thousands of mistakes, that we were produced from many, many mistakes, and, of course, we know mistakes almost always don't help, they hurt, and that's exactly what we see with mutations.
Interesting indeed. The very thing that I would imagine in popular understanding is the chief mechanism for better and better organization of information by the cells turns out to be just the opposite. Oops. And yet that wasn't really Darwin's main problem, the science of it, because, as you pointed out, he was more of a politician operating within a scientific environment or scientific culture. He was not somebody who was there to show a great deal of tremendous research and observational prowess. Today's guest is Dr. Jerry Bergman. He is the author of The Dark Side of Charles Darwin. He's also taught many different branches of life sciences for over 30 years. So he's passingly familiar with a laboratory, we might say. We mentioned just briefly in passing, maybe it's worth going back a bit. Describe a little bit about just how intensely miserable Darwin's psychology became after around the age of 30.
Well, that's easy. He had many, many, many psychological problems, and I could list a few of them. One problem which I note when I give presentations on this is he loved to kill anything he could, not just with guns, but with sticks and even hammers. And when he was young, he killed a puppy dog, and he said he did this just for the pure enjoyment of doing this. In fact, Fitzroy, who worked with him, said Darwin picked up his hammer. This is on the Beagle when he was taking a trip around the world. Fitzroy wrote that Darwin picked up his hammer and began killing the peaceful birds, and away went the hammer with all the force of his own, Darwin's, right arm. That illustrates, I think, some of his attitudes. When he was a young boy, he said he, quote, beat a puppy simply from enjoying the sense of power. And that he recorded in his autobiography. And that certainly makes one question his beliefs, and yet he eventually believed that God was sadistic because God would allow, for example, insects to be eaten and other creatures to be consumed by their prey, and he felt that was that was somehow wrong, and yet he himself was more sadistic than what he claimed God was. Of course, we know there's theological reasons for what we see, the evil we see in the world, but he also said, quote, "As a little boy, I was very much given to inventing deliberate falsehoods, and this was always done for the sake of causing excitement." So he admitted to lying and stealing totally for fun when he was a boy. One of the most traumatic things that happened to him was the loss of his daughter Annie when she was 10 years old. And his anger at God was such where he would not even go to his own daughter's funeral. He stayed away. And here I found the quote relative to his mental problems. He had, and just a list here, and this is documented in his own writing, so it's not taken secondhand. It was from what he himself said. He suffered from severe depression, insomnia, incapacitated anxiety, fits of hysterical crying, depersonalization, vision alterations, in other words, hallucinations, malaise, vertigo. He couldn't walk right. He would get shaky, get dizzy. Shaking, tachycardia, that's a rapid heartbeat. Fainting spells, shortness of breath, trembling, nausea, vomiting, dizziness, muscle twitches, spasms, tremors, cramps, colics, nervous exhaustion, scalp blisters, eczema, tinnitus, that's ringing of the ears, sensation of loss of consciousness, and impending death. And this is just a partial list of the problems that he had. He vomited so often that he actually, in his study, he installed a vomitorium, which is a little stainless steel sink, although his was porcelain, actually. That in his day, that's what they were made from. And then when he had to vomit, he'd just go in there and he'd vomit, and then he could leave. He wouldn't have to go upstairs to a bathroom to vomit. Michael Roos, by the way, very well-known scholar of Darwin, said Darwin was, quote, an invalid from the age of 30 until he died. So this indicates the severity of his health problems, which clearly affected his ideas and his attitude, especially towards God, and his actually anger towards God.
He was an invalid in terms of being a self-enforced recluse. And one of the things in that list that you read, which struck me the most, is if he were to give a talk to a group, and I think he was fairly sought after, actually, by people of the day, it would be preceded by a day of vomiting. That's, I've experienced the jitters when I first did television. I was a little jumpy, and other people have had similar sense of butterflies. I think that's normal, but you get over it. You get over it during the show, and you certainly learn to just go past it as time goes on. But Darwin, rather than going past some of these problems that normal people might face from time to time, he just sort of sank deeper and deeper into them, which is the picture that I left with after reading your account. Yeah,
they were clearly extreme. And today, if he was around, he probably would be labeled psychotic and possibly hospitalized, or at least be on medication. The major diagnosis that people give is he was agoraphobic. He had a fear of crowds. He had a fear of people. And he had a hard time going anywhere without his wife. And if he went somewhere, he almost always went to what he called safe houses. And these safe houses were his cousins, his relatives, close friends, and so on. He had a hard time going to anywhere else aside from these safe houses, and that indicates the level of his agoraphobia that he had. And when he was young, there's no evidence he had these problems. So one can only conclude that he developed these problems as a result of his ideas about trying to, quote, murder God. In fact, his God was natural selection. He said, and I'll quote him, said, "I speak of natural selection as an active power or deity. It is difficult to avoid personifying the word nature, but I mean by nature only the aggregate action and product of many natural laws." So his God was basically the natural laws, which he concluded produced humans, produced all life, produced the world. Natural laws like gravity and electromagnetism and so on. This is what he was referring to by natural laws. So our Creator, in essence, becomes forces like gravity, the electromagnetic attraction, the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, and so on. And, of course, this is absurd because we have no reason to believe, no evidence whatsoever that indeed these forces can produce what we see in the natural world, like people and dogs and life and plants and so on.
I've heard the term natural selection for most of my life. That's what they were telling me about in the government schools that I attended. And yet it wasn't, I didn't really fully realize the deception of those two words until reading your account of Darwin and his life. Selection, implies a selector. It implies intelligence. And yet, as you just pointed out, Darwin rules out any intelligence in the bumbling along of natural laws producing things that actually they can't produce because they can't create new genetic information needed to produce a, quote, higher life form. So natural selection really was probably one of the sneakiest, most effective curveballs that ever got pitched in intellectual history.
Well, that's true, yeah. Natural selection is elimination. It's not creation, it's destruction. It's not creating new things, but it's eliminating things. It's death. In fact, many people use the term death or elimination or extinction as synonyms for natural selection because that's what it is. So what we need is the opposite of natural selection. We need the creation of new things, not the elimination of old things. And that's, of course, a major problem with Darwin's idea.
There was a lot of racism inherent in the way Darwin developed his thinking, and that is that those little brown people, say on the, the island of the Fuegians, is that the way it's pronounced? Folks
right.
that lived in the South Pacific, they were brown, they were not well, few of them were educated at all. They were a kind of a primitive culture, and therefore they, in Darwin's mind, apparently were absolutely the missing link between a modern white man and an ape. And he had, the science, quote unquote, that he used to extract information from them about their culture would, I think, today be labeled as nothing other than out and out fraud. He had an objective. He knew ahead of time where he wanted his, quote, science to go, and so he would coach them, as you point out, how to give the kind of answers that he was looking for. He would disregard any other answers that didn't fit what he wanted. And so all of a sudden, this rather peaceful people, apparently, end up in Darwin's account as a bunch of cannibals.
Yeah,
Whoa.
That's true. And he felt eventually the, quote, inferior races, like Negroes and other races, would go extinct. And he said, therefore, the gap between humans and monkeys would be greater because he felt these races were somewhat in between humans and monkeys. And, he used the term savages over and over and over again. He said you could hardly believe these people were human. And he said, specifically, I can quote what he said, actually. He says, the civilized races are now everywhere extending their range so as to take the place of the lower races. Of course, Darwin believed these eventually would lose their life in the struggle of survival of the fittest.
And it wasn't that long after Darwin that people came along thinking, hey, we can help evolution along. We can get rid of these inferior races. And that's where I'd like for us to pick up after we get back from the break. Dr. Jerry Bergman on Darwin.
Now, more news about the threats to your liberties and your right to keep and bear arms. This is the Gun Owners News Hour. And here once again is your host, Executive Director of Gun Owners of America, Larry Pratt.
Over the break, I was thinking about some notes that I had made from Dr. Jerry Bergman's The Dark Side of Charles Darwin. As it was clear, we haven't touched on it a whole lot, but Darwin, any faith that he might have professed was pretty much a public fig leaf. The reality was that Darwin increasingly throughout his life thought as a pagan, no room for God. Evolution, as you've pointed out, Dr. Bergman, was in part designed to show how we can have come about without a God at all. That's the mechanism of evolution, don't you know? Well, one of the blind spots of a pagan, quote-unquote, scientist is that he doesn't understand the transformational impact of Christianity on a culture. And yes, there had been a time when the Fuegians, if I got the pronunciation of that right, he had no idea that there had been a before and an after with them, and that many of them had become professing and practicing Christians. And Darwin was apparently clueless as to the impact that it had on their culture. He could only see brown primitive.
Right. Yep. One thing he said, which really upsets people today, is he said, quote, we do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build elimination, of course, we're talking about natural selection. We build asylums for the imbecile. Our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone at the last moment. Said that vaccination has preserved thousands who, from a weak constitution, would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. But, he says, thus the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. But he concludes that it's a problem when we save the weak. We need to eliminate the weak so that, therefore, the strong can thrive. And he said that's being practical, that's not going to happen. He realized that's not going to happen. But nonetheless, he felt that in an ideal world that we would eliminate the weak or allow the weak to die and encourage the strong to propagate. And, of course, those are the very ideas that Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin and Mao and others used in order to further their own ideas. So although we don't know that Hitler read Darwin, probably he didn't because I don't think he could read English, but we know that Darwin certainly affected many German scientists like Ernst Haeckel, and we know that Darwin was affected other German scientists as well, his writings, his ideas, and we know, of course, that Adolf Hitler was strongly affected by many German biologists and was familiar with evolutionary theory, and therefore he tried to apply this. In fact, he said Nazism is nothing more than science applied to society. And, of course, we know what happened relative to the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews were killed, and, of course, about 5 million Christians, mostly Polish Christians, were killed specifically because of their religion and their ethnicity.
And in some cases, those who were killed were the lame, maybe the retarded. So there was some of that guiding hand of man in human, quote, evolution even at that point. And that's really pretty ugly stuff, too.
Yeah. He virtually wiped out the patients in many psychiatric and mental hospitals in Germany and other countries as well. He was trying to eliminate, again, those who are weak. And ironically, some of those who were in those facilities were not problematic because of genetics, but they had some injury that they sustained or some other problem which had nothing to do with genetics. And so many of those that he eliminated to try to produce a superior race didn't do any good because their problem was not genetic, and they would not have passed that on anyways. And, of course, many of them were not in a position to pass any genes on because they weren't married, they couldn't be married, they were in an institution, and so, therefore, a lot of his ideas were Darwinian-inspired but turned out to be wrong and harmful to society.
Well, wrong at the origin of your thinking, wrong at the outcome of your action. Not too surprising that. One of the things, and we don't have a whole lot of time, but it needs to be pointed out that Darwin didn't really think up his theory on his own. Not only was it generally speaking in the intellectual environment of the time, and it had been for some time before, but he, as you point out, pretty much lifted, if not word for word, many places perhaps so, and certainly the ideas and the direction of thinking of Alfred Wallace, an evolutionary thinker.
Yeah, among others. And
among others.
His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, had the very similar ideas. So it said that he didn't originate the theory of evolution, he popularized it. He made it much more well-known because his book sold so many copies, and he was very active in proselytizing his ideas. And when he got somebody to accept his ideas, he would interestingly use the word convert. We got a convert here, that this person accepted the idea of evolution there. Therefore, we have a convert, and he was proud of this. He was trying to convert, of course, those in his acquaintance to accept his idea. He was trying to affect the worldview of the people around him.
So the thing that I took away, if Darwin excelled in anything, it was political abilities. It was sales, if you will, selling an idea. It was even sometimes denouncing somebody else while stealing from yet another person. The guy was, without God, it's bad enough for Christians trying to be scrupulous, but when you have specifically murdered God, not a whole lot of chance that you might be too concerned about being on the up and up.
That's true. That's a good point.
So here we have a society, the United States of America, the Western world in general, influenced by a monumental intellectual thief and fraud who offered almost no evidence to his theory ever, and the evidence he entered turns out to be, oh boy, you call that evidence? It's really not much of a basis.
He was a very good salesperson. In fact, a number of scholars of Darwin have pointed out that this is one of his strongest traits, that he would very effectively sell his ideas. He would invite famous scientists to his house, and he had a nice house and maids and servants and so on, and he'd invite them for a week to vacation. They could go horseback riding, and they could just, leisurely sit and talk and so on. And during this time, he would slowly present his ideas to them. So his idea was basically to sell them his worldview, and he did that by really treating them very, very nice. These were not wealthy people necessarily, and he would put them in an environment which was quite luxurious, and they could relax, and they could. His wife would play the piano, and he would have famous guests come over and so on. And by these effective means, he was able to help his ideas be spread to influential biologists, and of course then they spread them throughout the world. And now we have a world which basically venerates Darwin as few other people. In fact, two people in the world you can criticize and get in trouble. One is Muhammad and the other is Darwin.
That's a very good point. And, of course, both are the enemies of civilization. Well, there we have it. The impact on the Second Amendment community is just as great as it is on society at large. No God, no right and wrong, no Second Amendment right that is, after all, viewed as pre-existing the coming into being of the Constitution. Those are 18th century notions, folks, that have got to go. Charles Darwin says so. Dr. Jerry Bergman, thanks so much for the dark side of Charles Darwin.
Be sure to join us next week. And remember, it's not just about gun control, it's about control.